Hi everyone. In this week's lab, we are going to cover comparative anatomy, and we are first starting with the lower invertebrates. Essentially, this week we are examining an overview of all the body systems that we have. So, even though we're going to cover the digestive, respiratory, circulatory, and reproductive systems really quick and looking at different animals, we do have dedicated labs to each of these systems in the upcoming week. But we are starting off with the invertebrates today. These are animals without a backbone. And the first system that we are going to examine is the digestive system. So think of digestion as a process of breaking down the molecule of food that you eat into smaller and simpler molecules so that the cells in your body can absorb it for metabolism. With digestion, there are two types. We have simple and complex. The name really gives away the differences between the two. In a simple digestive system, just think of it as something happening very simply. Food comes in via one opening and it leaves via the same opening. So the mouth and the anus, it's a single cavity. Protozoan and jellyfish and the phylum Cnidarian, these are animals that have a simple digestive system. Moving on to a complex digestive system, here is where things starts to get a little bit more specialized. In a complex digestive system, the mouth and the anus are at two ends of the body usually, so they are both their own structure. And in addition to that, with a complex digestive system, animals sometimes have additional feeding appendages that can help them with obtaining food or breaking down food. There's also salivary glands that can help with chemically digesting food in the oral cavity. And then there are digestive enzymes and acid all throughout the intestinal tract to help break down food. So here are examples of simple digestive system. We have sponges, cnidarians, etc., jellyfish. And here are animals that have the complex digestive system. So earthworm, even though they look like very simple creature, they actually have a complex digestive system because the mouth and the anus are at opposite ends of the body. They're separate cavity, and they have an intestinal tract going throughout the entire length of their body. We see something similar for cockroach and rabbits as well. These are animals that have complex digestive system. This is something that should be familiar to us. This is a picture of a digestive organs in human. We can think of animals with a complex digestive system as having a plan where there's a tube within a tube design, meaning that food travels down a track. It travels down the tube, and each portion of the tube is an organ with their own specialized function. There's a function for grinding food, there's another organ for absorbing nutrients, and then there's another organ for reabsorbing water. So here is looking at additional structures that are specialized. In animals such as earthworm, birds, and chicken, they have a crop and a gizzards. Now, we don't have crops and gizzards in humans, but essentially crops and gizzards are two structures that comes before the intestinal tract. They're part of the intestinal tract, but essentially what's happening is that when the animal ingests the food item, the crop is a structure that helps stores the food and helps hold the food before it gets mechanically broken down. Now, the reason why this is opposite in humans is because in humans we have dentitions, we have teeth structures that actually crushes, physically, mechanically break down the food, and then we swallow it and it's stored in our stomach. But animals with crops and gizzards, the food is stored in the crop first, and then it passes into the gizzard. In the gizzards, there are these structures that help crushes the food. So it's a little bit reverse of how it works in these animals compared to humans. Humans, we crush up the food first with our teeth and then we store it in the stomach. In these animals, they store the food first and then they crush up the teeth using the gizzard. So you have a crop and the gizzard. Okay, and then looking at dentition, these are structures that are found in animals with a complex digestive system. And the interesting thing about the teeth structure is sometimes we can tell the diet of that animal by looking at the structures of their teeth. In the crayfish that you will be dissecting, you can see a pair of mandible protruding outside of their mouth. This is used to help crush the teeth. And then in some animals, they have the tongue that can be expelled outside of their body to sometimes maybe twice the length of their body to help catch prey items. And with a complex digestive system, there is even more specializations in some animals. Animals such as a cow, they have something called a ruminant stomach. Essentially, what this means is that when they swallow food, food passes through four of their stomachs. They passes through multiple stomachs, but instead of these stomachs being true stomachs, essentially what's happening is that the food can actually travel back up to their mouth through the esophagus for further chewing. So this is a regurgitation of their food. And doing this actually allows the animals to release more cellulase enzyme. So this is an enzyme that is being released when food travels through the stomach multiple times, and this enzyme is needed to break down a chemical called cellulose that's found in many of the diets of these animals. Rabbits, on the other hand, they do not have that enzyme cellulase that we have seen in the cows. But essentially, what's happening with rabbits is that they use a process called chromophagy to break down cellulose. So here we see food traveling through their intestinal tract, and essentially at the end, they're going to produce some pellets. So these are like feces, but it's not true feces because it actually travels up their hindgut another time. As it's traveling back up their hindgut, there are going to be bacteria that will break down the cellulose via fermentation. So this is really interesting to see what's happening in rabbits and how they break down cellulose. And again, this process of food traveling through their hindgut twice is called chromophagy. All right, so we do have a lab that looks specifically at the digestive organs in humans. So we will go over details on these structures later on. But essentially, this is a type of complex digestive system because there is a mouth and an anus, separate organs, and you have food traveling into the mouth, down the esophagus, into the stomach, where it's stored for about 4 to 6 hours before it moves into the small intestine, large intestine, and outside of the body. So, again, this is a type of complex digestive system. And we are going to go into these structures in more detail when we have the digestive lab, but here is a preview of what we will be examining. And in addition, because this is a type of complex digestive system, there are also accessory organs that we will be examining as well. The accessory organs in this case are organs that are close by the digestive system, or they can be inside the mouth as well. But essentially, the accessory organs are not the actual organs where food travels through, but they do secrete chemicals that are going to help with digestion. So we have the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Food does not travel through these organs, but these organs are going to secrete chemicals to help with the digestion process. So now we are moving on to the respiratory system. The main function of the respiratory system is to intake in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. Oxygen is a very important molecule because it is a chemical, a gas that the cells in our body use in order to perform metabolism so that we can generate ATP. But as a byproduct of metabolism, carbon dioxide is produced, and carbon dioxide is a waste product. So we need to have an organ to help take in oxygen, but then at the same time releases carbon dioxide. So there are three types of respiratory organs. Humans, mammals, we use the lungs. Insects, they have trachea, and fish, they have gills. So, starting off with the tracheae in insects, these are tiny tube structures that you can see on the surface of their skin. So, essentially, you have oxygen coming in and then carbon dioxide leaving. If you take a look at this picture, you'll see that it's not very efficient in terms of this type of respiratory system. There's not much increased surface area. So, one of the modern day theories of why current insects, modern insects, are not really big is because they do not have a efficient type of respiratory system. Humans, on the other hand, we have tidal breathing. The lungs is a little bit better than the trachea. And so essentially, with the lungs, this is the organ that is going to capture the oxygen that you breathe in through your nose. It travels down the trachea and then it goes to your lungs. And what happens is the trachea branches off into primary bronchi, which branches out to secondary, tertiary, and at the smallest tips, these are the bronchioles. So think of this as like a tree branch. And at the end of the bronchioles, you have the alveoli duct with the alveoli. And specifically, when you take a look here, this alveoli is the structure where gas exchange occurs. This is where oxygen diffuses out and gets picked up by your blood and goes back to your heart. And it is also where the deoxygenated blood dumps in the carbon dioxide back into here so that you can exhale it out. So these are the lungs. And again, we will examine the digestive and the respiratory organs in detail in an upcoming lab. And the last organ that we will examine in the respiratory part of this overview are the gills. So fish have gills. And out of all the respiratory organs that we discussed, the gills are the most efficient one because it's really hard to extract oxygen from water than it is from air. So fish essentially they use a counter current exchange system. Very briefly, how this works is that they have water flowing in through their gills. So as water is flowing through their gills, water comes in fully oxygenated and then it decreases as it's flowing through their gills. Blood, on the other hand, is flowing in the opposite direction. So it's called countercurrent exchange. Because blood is flowing in the opposite direction, when the blood returns to the body, if it's going in the opposite direction of when oxygen comes in, it's able to extract the most oxygen right here when the water initially flows in with high oxygen content. So it extracts the most oxygen here and then it transfers it back to the body of the fish. Birds are interesting. They have a cross current system when it comes to breathing. Do not confuse that with counter current in fish. But essentially, what cross current system does is that it really helps fish have a more efficient type of respiratory system because remember, it's also hard to extract oxygen at such a high altitude as well. So birds, I'm sorry. So birds, they actually have two inhalation and two exhalation. This is different from humans where we inhale and exhale. But essentially, when you look at the anatomy of the birds, they have a lung and then they have two air sacs. They have an anterior and a posterior air sac. So with the first inhalation, this is the first breath, this is when the oxygen goes to their posterior air sac. And then they exhale. In the first exhalation, the air does not leave their body right away. Instead, it goes from the posterior air sac to their lungs. Then they take in a second breath. It's during that second breath where the air in their lungs actually goes to the anterior air sac, and then also some new air goes into the posterior air sac as well. And then finally, in their second exhalation, the air leaves the body. Doing this allows them to really take in as much oxygen as possible so that it can stay in different air sacs and they have more oxygen available ready to them when needed. So there are two inhalation and two exhalation in birds, and this is called a type of system called cross current system breathing. Okay. All right, so now we are moving into the circulatory system. Okay. The main function of the circulatory system is to transport gases. And it's not only just gases, it's not only just oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide, but the circulatory system also transport important nutrients and hormones throughout the body as well. And it does this using the bloodstream. Okay, so there is a heart involved. But although the circulatory system is important, not all animals will have a circulatory system. So, not all animals will actually have a heart. Some primitive organisms, like sea stars, they do not have a circulatory system. Um, Sea anemones, jellyfish, etc., same thing. So with these animals, instead of using a circulatory system, they use diffusion, the process of diffusion, or sometimes even a water vascular system to transport nutrients and gases throughout their body. In animals with a circulatory system, we can break up the circulatory system into two types. There is an open circulatory system and a closed circulatory system. Okay. With the open circulatory system, in these animals, there are no distinct blood vessels. So instead, their blood bathe their organs. And in arthropods, we refer to the blood as a hemolymph. Um, so if you take a look at these animals, you don't really see any distinct type of blood vessels. The hemolymph, the blood bathes their body. So any animals in the phylum arthropods, phylum molluscas, they are going to have an open circulatory system. Moving into the closed circulatory system, now we see blood in vessels. These vessels are arteries, veins. This is where the blood is being pumped throughout their body. In animals with a closed circulatory system, these are going to be earthworms in the phylum Annelidas and vertebrates. Okay. All right, so with a closed circulatory system, if we take a look at fish, we see that fish, they have a two-chamber heart. Amphibians, they have a three-chamber heart. Reptiles, there's a 3 to 4 chamber heart. The reason why is that there's a septum right here, which doesn't really divide up the heart completely. And then mammals, there is a 4 chamber heart, mammals and birds. So essentially, the chambers are divisions within the actual heart structure itself. So humans, we have a 4 chamber heart, which meaning that these chambers right here are completely separated from one another via valves, essentially different structures. And the good thing, though, is when we look at the circulatory system in mammals and birds, this is a very efficient type of circulatory system. Before, we talked about how mammals, we don't have the best respiratory organs. The animals that do have a good respiratory organs are fish because they have gills. But when it comes to the heart, mammals and birds, our circulatory system is actually very efficient because it's a 4 chamber heart. Each chamber, there's a complete separation between oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and because of that, the blood that is leaving the heart, that is being trapped, that is being pumped to go to the rest of the body, contains fully oxygenated blood. So this is a very efficient type of circulatory organ, the heart, in mammals and birds. And then finally, we are going to end with the reproductive system. The main function of the reproductive system is to pass on genetic materials. And when we examine how genetic materials are being passed on, we have to look at the fertilization event. So, fertilization is where the egg is going to meet the sperm. So, with fertilization, there can be external fertilization or internal. External, like the name suggests, this is when the egg and the sperm meet each other outside of the body. So most invertebrate and some fish, there is an event called spawning where the animals have to mutually release their gametes all at once to increase the chance of fertilization happening outside the body. This is usually triggered by environmental cues. Other animals have internal fertilization. This is where the sperm has to be deposited into the female reproductive tract. So, as you can see, there are pros and cons to both of these types of methods. With external fertilization, there could be a higher increased chance of fertilization if you release a whole bunch of gametes at the same time. However, there's nothing protecting the gametes after fertilization. There's nothing protecting the organisms, the newly developed organisms after fertilization. With internal fertilization, there's usually some cost when it comes to depositing the sperm into the egg. Usually, there is some complex mating behavior. The the female usually have to care for the offspring, and the pros, on the other hand, would then be that, well, if it's internal, there is something protecting the developing zygote. And with internal fertilization, the female can either lay eggs, this is a process called oviparous, or there can be a live birth, which is called viviparous. Now, with reproduction, we are going to look at the male parts first and then move on to the female. So, with reproduction, and for the male parts, spermatogenesis is the process of sperm production. Sperm are produced in the testis right here. Now, although the testis is an organ that produces sperm, it also is an organ that produces the male the androgen, which is known as the male hormone. But remember that this is not necessarily true, because females can also produce testosterone as well. So essentially, androgen is a sex steroid hormone. There are higher levels in males, but it is not purely a male hormone because it's found in females as well. But going back to the testes can be found outside of the body cavity or nestle inside. It really depends on the species that we are looking at. And more specifically, when we take a look at the testis and we take a look at the anatomical parts of it, inside the testis, there are these seminiferous tubules. These are the specific structure inside the testis where sperm are produced. Now, the interesting thing is that some animals, they actually package up their sperm. The males actually package up their sperm into packets called spermatophores, and they can deliver this to the female as a gift. The female can accept it by taking it and putting it inside her reproductive cavity for fertilization, or she can reject it by eating it, because the spermatophore, it has a lot of nutrients in it. All right, so with internal fertilization, animals that use internal fertilization, they need to find a way to deposit the the sperm into the female reproductive tract. So essentially, we are going to look at various intromittent organs. The word intro means to enter. So these are organs that are used to deposit sperm into the female reproductive tract. Male fish and aquatic arthropods, such as the crayfish that you will be examining, they use a gonopods to transfer sperm into the female. So right here, the first two pairs of swimmerets, it's super thick. These are the gonopods in male crayfish. Some reptiles, like lizards and snakes, they have a split penis. So this is called a hemipene. It's essentially a modification of their cloaca, and this is what is used to transfer sperm into the female reproductive tract. And interestingly enough, snakes, especially the species that mate in colonies, they may even have spikes on their hemipene, so it stays latched in in the female reproductive tract while they are mating, so that another male cannot come in. Elasmobranchs, such as rays and sharks, they have a modified pelvic fin called a clasper right here. This is what they use to deliver sperm into the female reproductive tract. And mammals, turtles, and crocodiles, these organisms, they use a penis to deliver sperm. All right, so that was the male reproductive structures. We are going to move on to the female reproductive structures now. So females, the eggs are produced in the ovaries. Now, when we saw the testes earlier, the testes can be outside or nestled inside the body cavity of males. The ovaries, the structure that produces the eggs, these structures are always inside of the female body. Okay. All right, so the ovaries is the site where eggs are stored, and there are hormones, estrogen and progesterone, that are being produced within the ovaries as well. And from there, the egg travels through the fallopian tube, also known as the oviduct. This is found in humans. And then the uterus is where the um, conceptive product, the conceptus, which is where the zygote is going to implant in. So the picture on top is showing you the female anatomical parts in humans, but as you can see, when we take a look at other species, this right here is a uterine horn that you can find in animals such as pigs, dogs, cats, a lot of rodents. And this difference between the uterus of women compared to the uterine horn in these animals is you see a bifurcation right here. And then the uterine horn has some segmented parts, and this allows for these animals to carry multiple offspring, which is very interesting. So this is a difference between the reproductive structure of women versus other animals that can have litters. Okay. All right, so I know that was a very, very brief overview at all the organ systems. However, as promised, we do have dedicated labs that is going to look at each system in detail. So we're going to start off with looking at the inverts, and we're going to examine all of these systems. And we are going to do dissections um, on these animals. From the phylum Nematoda, we are going to do a dissection on the roundworms. These are parasitic worms. We're going to look at their digestion, how they breathe, or do they breathe, or what other structures they use to breathe, etc. We're going to look at their reproductive structures as well. In the phylum Annelida, we are going to look at segmented earthworms. In the phylum Mollusca, we are going to examine the clams. In the phylum Arthropoda, we are going to examine the crayfish, and in the phylum Echinodermata, we are going to examine the sea star. All right, so that is an overview, and I will see you in lab for the dissection part. Thank you.